Greetings to all the subscribers of the Muse Wealth Partners eNewsletter. I'm just sending another newsletter this month. It's not often I send two in a month, but I will be away for most of April. And I've also happened to read a number of good articles I want to share with you again. As we're entering tax season as well, I'm also including with this email a link to Canaccord Genuity's latest 2025 Wealth Planning Facts and Figures. This document is, I think, a treasure trove of information. I've been sharing ones like this with my clients since back in the bank days. So if you ever have questions about things like what tax rates are, what the RIF minimum withdrawal rates are, RSP or TFSA contribution limits, and various other stuff, you'll probably find it on here. And other than that, I'd also like to recommend checking out my resources section on my website. You'll find a link in the email, which also has links to a number of other good resources, especially come tax time. The last couple of videos, we've been talking about the drawdown in the markets. I'm once again sharing my volatility first aid kit, as I'll be going on vacation soon, and undoubtedly, every time I go on vacation, the markets pull back. The volatility toolkit is at your disposal. This is just putting in perspective what the current S&P 500 drawdown is at. So we did see a drawdown of just over 10% in the negative, and we're now sitting at 6% below the all-time high. So again, just to put it into perspective, a lot of people, for whatever reasons, often political reasons, talk about this crash in the markets. Not really a crash when you look at it in the greater scheme of things. In the last 10 years, we've certainly seen much, much worse. And of course, over the very long term, we see that drawdowns like this are very, very normal. They're extremely normal. Some data suggests that they happen on average once a year, or maybe once every 1.5 years. And what can we do as investors? The same as always, simply ignore it, because it's impossible to predict when these drawdowns will happen. It is impossible to predict when the bottom will be. If we just look back in the last, just the last week or so, I guess it turns out March 13th was the bottom of this drawdown. What was happening on that day? Probably a lot of negative news, and there was no way of predicting that was going to be when things turned around. And then again, too, we look at some longer term numbers, and there's no way of knowing that we're going to recover from this and hit new all-time highs either. We very well could be in a similar type of pattern as we were back in 2022. There is no way of knowing this. What we do know, if we were investors exactly 3 years ago, that would have been the beginning of 2022, just before things started to get really crappy. So, we did have that almost 10% drop and then a recovery. Looked like things were going better, but then worse, and then a recovery, and so on and so on. So this was the experience of an investor who simply ignored all the noise in 2022, sat through almost 2 years of being in the negative, and eventually saw themselves up about 20%. This again is of course looking at just the S&P 500. So if we look at this from the Canadian perspective, as an investor, say in a very diversified global equity portfolio, this is not a recommendation, but just an example of a Vanguard fund that owns all the indexes, Canadian, US, and international. This is the experience. So when we diversify, not only do we see less of a decline when the markets go bad, again, that's the orange line, which is more diversified, we do perhaps not see as much of an increase when things go better, but over time, diversification has worked pretty nicely. So anyway, my latest newsletter on top of that includes our latest podcast that Justin and I put together talking about, do you have a will? I think there's something in this for everybody. Some of the stuff I have in my good read section, a great post put out by Michael Batnick titled, "We're going to be like three Fonzies here," which again echoes what I have always been saying. And the nice thing is, if you don't believe me, there are plenty of other very smart experts out there telling you exactly the same thing. Barry Ritholtz just put out a book, How Not to Invest. I just started reading it. It's a good read and also has very much the same message. I'm just a few chapters into it about ignoring the noise. And we're talking about Barry Ritholtz being a guy who often is on the noise networks talking, someone who has actually been successful in predicting the markets at times. But he too is saying ignore the noise if you want to be a successful investor. And also, I just have to share a great piece put out by CBC Marketplace. I think it was just put out this weekend, that brought into their studio some of these anti-scammers whose stuff I've been sharing for years on these newsletters as well, showing what they do, what is going on out there, how are people getting scammed out of their money. Have a look and see what they're actually doing to combat the scammers. And mostly the reason I share these a lot of the time are just so that people can see what is actually going on out there. And these scams are always evolving. I'll always try to, if I hear about something new, I'll try to share that as well. We saw a really pernicious scam a couple of weeks ago in my last newsletter. I shared that one with you about some shady people offering GICs online, attracting the average investor just looking for a slightly better interest rate than they can get at their bank, and basically stealing all of their money. So knowing that kind of stuff is going on helps you protect yourself, helps you protect your loved ones as well from potentially getting scammed. You're always welcome to share these newsletters with anyone who you think would get value from them. Anyone's able to go to my website to subscribe. By all means, if you have any questions, all you need to do is reply to this email and I'll do my best to respond. Anyways, I will put out my next e-newsletter probably in late April, and so long for now.